I also would like to start thanking the organizers of this international meeting for their invaluable help and generous invitation. And now, without further ado, I will get started. So some time ago, I tentatively proposed a new layer of interpretation of a recurrent pictorial motif in a vast array of archaic vases depicting two famous heroes at play, namely Ajax and Achilles. Our first speaker, Professor Véronique Dassin, has estimated that there are more than 160 vases, Attic vases, dating from the 6th and 5th centuries before current era, more specifically from 540 to 475, with the two players dicing. Indeed, in the entire repertory of the vases, Ajax and Achilles are the names most frequently assigned to the two players in this figure decoration, which may well lead us to the conclusion that when they are not labeled, we can take it for granted that they still represent these two famous figures. Next slide, please. To the best of my knowledge, there are only 4 exceptions to this rule, such as the one in a vase by the Amasis painter that you are now seeing, where the two board game players are named as Oneiroi, and they are obviously not heroic, not even human. And I think that Professor Véronique Dassin has displayed in her PowerPoint presentation 2 other pictures of 2 citizens playing. Next slide, please. Many of the pieces of pottery adorned with the motif of Ajax and Achilles playing a board game also show the presence of the goddess Athena in a rather formulaic way, facing the viewer and standing between the players. According to Susan Woodford, this new variation was introduced in the decade from 530 to 520. The goddess is usually depicted either in front of the gaming table, as in this slide, or behind it, as in the following slide. Could you please? Exactly. Holding her spear in one hand while making a gesture as if speaking with the other one, and looking, in my opinion, rather sternly at Achilles. And I must say that I part company with MAHE, though her description of the famous Exequian vase is splendid, is brilliant, but she claims that the goddess gesture, I quote, is surely one of amazement, I do agree, and pleasure at the victory of the player on the left. And I honestly cannot see her elated or in pleasure, but still, it's my opinion. As per the players, they are in most cases armed, holding their spears, and in more or less full armor, with the rest of their weapons, shields, and sometimes even helmets, like in this case, lying behind them. Both of them seem so engrossed in the game they are playing that they don't even seem to notice the goddess' presence. Next slide, please. Furthermore, in long frieze decorations from larger pieces of pottery, such as the exteriors of drinking cups, the players seem completely indifferent to the battle that their fellow warriors are actually fighting on both sides of them. Next slide, please. Now, Exequias is normally assumed to be one of the first artists who depicted the motif of the two heroes playing a board game. Yet the actual meaning of such recurrent iconography throughout the archaic period still remains a conundrum. One of the main strands of interpretation is to be found in religion. The depiction is thought to represent a scene of ritual divination before fighting. Following this interpretation, the players are dicing in order to guess whether the battle will be won or not, the goddess Athena confirming the outcome by means of gesticulation. This interpretation was proposed by Boucher-Leclerc in the 19th century, and it has been recently backed up by precisely one Spanish historian, Antón Alvar Nuño. Besides this claromantic interpretation, an alternative proposal has been put forward based on realism. The scene would then just have to do with the quotidian, that is, with an imaginative reconstruction of daily life in the Greek camp during the siege of Troy. And this second interpretation was put forward by Susan Woodford. As such, the goddess favors Achilles to win the game, regardless of the battle taking place behind them. A third interpretation is related to politics, pointing to an anti-tyrannical mood. The scene of the greatest heroes caught off guard draws on a mythical allegory of a historical fact in Athens, Pisistratus' return to Attica in 546, as told by Herodotus in his first book of the Histories. The depiction of the two players would thus serve the double function of comforting the Athenians for their weakness akin to that of Ajax and Achilles, while at the same time warning that in the face of tyranny and defeat, survival lies with the alert. And this third interpretation was offered by Bodman. Finally, a fourth interpretation deals with the symbolic associations displayed in the depiction of the two heroes gracefully playing in the midst of war. Their relaxed, though concentrated countenance expresses not only the idea of self-domain, but also of cunning and strategy, thus turning itself into a powerful iconic metaphor of the male aristocratic excellence, or aristeia, ever so competitive in the game of war. Moreover, their playing with dice equally highlights the element of luck, or the will of the gods, in the eventual result. As such, the iconographical motif of Ajax and Achilles playing a board game would encapsulate the tensions of the heroic or aristocratic ideology of war. And I owe this last interpretation to our first speaker, Professor Véronique Dassin, as she has brilliantly exposed in before. The main advantage of all these interpretations lies in the iconocentric vantage point which they seem to share. Indeed, they do not assume the picture to be either an illustration or a representation of an otherwise unknown literary text. In other words, the pictorial motif of Ajax and Achilles playing a board game very plausibly conveys, first and foremost, the fantasy of the painters when portraying two of the best-known heroes of the epic lore, possibly in their leisure time during the Trojan campaign. Next slide, please. Yet, the goddess' presence in the middle of the scene, in evidence of on at least 72 out of the 138 verses and fragments recorded by Susan Woodford, seems to introduce a narrative element which continues to challenge our full grasp of the whole picture. Why would the goddess appear in a scene of mere recreation? Could her presence merely allude to Achilles' advantage in the game, as proposed by Mommsen? Next slide, please. Surely it makes the epiphany of the goddess of war even more striking in the longer frieze decorations, where the two players are flanked by warriors in the strife of battle, as if our two heroes had deliberately abandoned their fellows, neglecting their military duties. Although Heide-Mossen argued that the central scene with the players should be considered independently from the surrounding frame with the fighters, Anneliese Cossatz-Deisman leaned towards interpreting the whole scene as an epiphany at the critical moment, with Athena handing victory to Achilles so he can finish the game and return to battle as soon as possible. In a similar vein, Susan Woodford, even though she lumps warriors together with other decorative elements such as sphinxes, maenads, etc., taking them to be purely conventional fillers which decorate extra space on the vases by many of the clumsier black figure painters, she also claims that it, I quote, may well have been the need to fill the long, low frieze of the cup exterior that made some of the better read figure painters ponder the theme more deeply. Perhaps some asked themselves why Athena might be present while the heroes played, and answered by suggesting that she must be there to rouse the heroes, to recall them to their duty. End of quote. In my opinion, the fact that the artists chose Ajax and Achilles in particular as the two players of the board game, among all the famous heroes of the Trojan War, might not have been banal, but actually struck a chord with the viewers, who were better acquainted than we are with the narrative traditions regarding the epic context of the Trojan cycle. The same might apply to the presence of Athena, and even to the conspicuous decorative filler of the flanking hoplites in the strife of battle, which is so noticeable in the later red figure vases. As Hedreen cogently argued, those vases, quote, show how vase painters working less than a generation after the creation of the theme envisioned the context of the game. They consistently depicted the heroes playing in the midst of a battle, which suggests that there was some agreement among vase painters about the occasion of the game, unquote. Without a doubt, what is in fact a recurrent element in virtually all these vases is the board game, which in the mythical tradition was an invention by Palamedes. Next slide, please. A hero absent from the Homeric poems, but figuring in the Trojan cycle. According to Martin West, among others, this was complete and current by about 550, or at any rate by 520 before current era, coinciding with the period of expansion of the iconographic motif we are discussing. Indeed, Palamedes is assumed to have played a relevant role in the Cypria, if not in a Palamedia, the latter being either an epic poem on its own or a part of the former Cypria or songs from Cyprus, especially devoted to the excellence of this remarkable hero. In the mythological imaginary, Palamedes became a byword for cultural hero, a figure rivaling Prometheus and sharing with him a long list of philanthropic inventions. Yet, the few nuggets of information available to us concerning Palamedes' role in archaic epic poetry show evidence of two interesting features worth mentioning, namely his remarkable abilities, first, to mobilize the Achaean army by means of recruiting the chieftains that would join the common expedition against Troy, and second, but most importantly, to improve the living conditions not only of humankind in general, but of the army camp in particular, especially in times of pressing need. Close reading of the disparate lore about his heroic performances sheds a certain light on them, which allows us to see Palamedes as a mastermind of organization at the service of an army, being constrained to function as a close-knit community for the sake of an unexpectedly prolonged campaign. By the way, Dr. Marco Vespa has written very articulately about this aspect of Palamedes as a hero of order and organization. Our main access to the epic poem of the Cypria relies on a late antique summary from the Chrestomati, a product of the 2nd century current era attributed to Proclus. Thanks to this summary, we know about the important part Palamedes played in the levy of the army, especially in the episode of Odysseus' enrollment. Next slide, please. Odysseus, so the story goes, was not exactly enthusiastic about joining the Achaean expedition and feigned madness to get out of it. Palamedes famously exposed Odysseus' deceitful scheme, an action that would eventually prove fatal to the former. In essence, the Cypria dealt with the first 9 years of the expedition against Troy, from the very beginning of the conflict till the start of the Iliad. Since the poem comprised only 11 books, its narrative pace must have been hasty and uneven, diametrically opposed to the detailed narrative of some 50 days of the siege, as told by Homer in the Iliad. To make matters worse, Proclus' summary obviously omits precious details about the plot. Consequently, there is plenty of room for speculation about the occasion and causes of Palamedes' death. However, there is no doubt about the culprits, since we have the testimony of Pausanias, who points the finger of responsibility at Diomedes and Odysseus, and explicitly says that he's taken this piece of information from the Cypria. In his succinct report, Pausanias says that Palamedes was killed while he was fishing. As generally acknowledged since antiquity, fishing was not considered an activity fit for a hero, nor fish a decent kind of diet for Homeric heroes. Consequently, some sort of explanation should be provided for a behavior so out of the ordinary in heroic times. The most convincing one relates Palamedes' fishing pursuits with an episode of famine in the camp, which made the hero exert his resourcefulness to find some way out of such dire circumstances. Later sources relate the invention of board games, kiboi and pesoi, by Palamedes precisely with an episode of famine. Next slide, please. Sophocles, who wrote not just one, but up to 4 plays about Palamedes, offers us a revealing passage where an unknown speaker, perhaps, as Alan Somerston suggests, Odysseus, Palamedes' very rival, puts the invention of drafts and dice down to Palamedes in a context of famine and inaction, argia. Another Sophoclean fragment from these unfortunately lost plays specifies the kind of board games this hero invented, the pentagrammae and the throwing of dice. Not only Sophocles, but also Aeschylus, Euripides, and other tragic playwrights such as Aristidemus the Younger composed tragedies dealing with Palamedes or simply mentioned him in their plays. A catalogue of his numerous inventions was the trademark of these theatrical versions, where the innocence of the hero so unfairly put to death by Odysseus was debated. Even Gorgias and Alcidamas wrote speeches for and against Palamedes and his inventions, among which we recurrently find the board games. Next slide, please. Interestingly, Ascolion on Euripides' Orestes expressly relates Palamedes' inventions of dice and letters with an episode of famine and forced inaction in Aulis at the beginning of the Trojan campaign. In his Iphigenia in Aulis, Euripides himself depicts Protesilaus with Palamedes, Poseidon's grandson, playing checkers, enjoying the many intricate shapes of the game. As such, Woodford put forward the possibility that some artists may have mentally set the scene of our two heroes playing at Aulis. In particular, vases such as the Lekythos, next slide please, you are now seeing, where the heroes are not properly armed, may conjure up the image not of tedious guard duty at Troy, but of taking a break from maneuvers at Aulis. According to Woodford, the presence of birds on a number of vases also suggests a connection with Aulis, since it was there that the omen of the sparrow, she says sparrow, with its 8 young was observed. Palm trees are also associated with Aulis, end of quote. And next slide, please, because you can see a detail of the vase. And I have to say that according to McHale, palm trees could also represent Troy. So not necessarily Aulis, but also Troy. So indeed, even from an iconocentric point of view, there is an undeniable connection between the board game, Palamedes, and the heroes of the Trojan War. But let us go back to the epic poem of the Cypria, far closer in time to the expansion of the iconographic motif of Ajax and Achilles playing a board game. Next slide, please. In the resume made by Proclus, the death of Palamedes is immediately followed by the rage of Achilles and his decision not to fight anymore in the war against the Trojans. Because of its brevity, the shorthand offered by Proclus draws on some prior knowledge on the part of his readers regarding the epic poetry that we now lack. As far as the resume goes, there is no explicit link between Palamedes' death and the rage of Achilles, apart from the juxtaposition of the two facts, there being no reference to the cause of Achilles' rage in any way. However, in spite of the fact that the author is almost exclusively concerned with stating the bare actions of the poem, regardless of the narrative links that relate them to each other, the possibility of a strong connection between Palamedes' death and Achilles' rage nonetheless remains open. Not in vain, Allen suggested that the Cypria actually narrated a variant account on the wrath of Achilles, pre-Homeric in origin, in which the murder of Palamedes is the cause of Achilles' withdrawal. It will be a learned writer from the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, Common Era, so a contemporary with, more or less a contemporary with Proclus, Philostratus, who will make explicit the causal bond between the death of Palamedes and the wrath not only of Achilles, but also of Ajax. In his Heroicus, a typical product of the Paideia at the time, the author carries out a thorough revision of the Homeric poems and makes an authorized informant of the Trojan events state that both heroes reacted angrily against Palamedes' death by breaking up with the Achaeans and refusing to continue fighting. If both Ajax and Achilles took a break from their participation in the war because of their close friendship with Palamedes and as a protest against his death, the image of both heroes leaning over the board game invented by Palamedes while their comrades in arms keep on fighting against the Trojans would then be an appealing reference to these popular heroes and their well-known myth. Next slide, please. Moreover, in keeping with the mythical tradition, the presence of the goddess Athena as a protector of both Achilles and especially of Diomedes and Odysseus, together with her probable hostility towards Ajax and perhaps Palamedes himself, would make perfect sense. Woodford pointed out that the goddess never looks at Ajax, but at Achilles. As such, her exhortative gesture could be seen as meaning to prevent Achilles from allying with the victim of his patroness' ploys and to force him to rejoin the war against her most hated enemies, the Trojans. Next slide, please. In my view, demonstrating with total certainty the influence of the historical, religious, literary, and political events on a vase painter is as difficult as assuring the absolute originality of the pictorial artist, regardless of any external influence whatsoever. I fully agree with Oliver Taplin that it is worth pointing out essential references without which the painting loses much of its point to the viewer. In the particular case of the vases portraying Ajax and Achilles playing a board game, the originality of the artists, especially of the red figure ones, should be praised for the subtlety of the metonymic means by which they allude to the epic inventor of the cleverest ways of passing time, as well as to his more committed friends. Thank you for listening.